news exclusive from the Start Trade Times. Here is something interesting. On 3rd March this year, India became the world's most populous country with 1,428 million people. According to data from the World Population Review, India pushed China, which has a population of 1,425 million people, to the second place. When it comes to the size of the economy, India has already become the world's 5th largest economy in the 75th year of its independence and will reach the $3.5 trillion mark by the end of this month. India's aviation sector is the fastest growing one in the world today, and it ranks 3rd below the US and China. But for a country of 1.4 billion people and a rapidly growing manufacturing center, how big should India's air cargo sector be? As of today, it is too small in comparison to other major economies in the top 10 ranking. But given the context and the momentum Indian aviation sector has today, the opportunities are huge despite several headwinds. According to a latest report released by Trade and Transport Group, despite India's air cargo market being only 1/5 of the size of the Chinese market, India's air cargo market has been extremely dynamic in the last few years, and the growth trajectory of the Indian economy bodes well for the air cargo services. To discuss the key findings of the report, I am now joined by Frederic Horst, one of the founders of the Trade and Transport Group. Frederic joins me from Sydney in Australia. Frederic, thanks for talking to us.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Take us through some of the key findings of this report released.
Okay, so, obviously, as we all know, that the air cargo industry, in terms of growth overall last year, didn't do particularly well. So traffic levels globally declined by about 8%. Traffic levels in the international express business declined by about 7 or 8% as well. India, on the other hand, saw approximately 10% growth in 2022 in international traffic and around 8% growth in the domestic market. And we're in a situation right now where the size of the domestic air cargo market is on par with what it was in 2018. We generally view 2018 as a reference point rather than 2019, just because 2019 wasn't a particularly good year for the cargo industry overall, and India was no exception there. So worldwide cargo volumes already declined by about 3% in 2019. International cargo market is not quite where it was in 2019, 2018. So if we're comparing it to, say, 2019, last quarter, last year, the international market was still about 8% down. And that's much less down in the passenger business. So the passenger business was about 12% down. So belly capacity, very important for international cargo markets in India, for domestic cargo markets as well. And until that capacity really comes back in full, we're not going to see the kind of recovery that we would expect. But from a number of perspectives, what's been going on in the Indian cargo market and so in trade has been quite exciting, because we've seen quite a few years of growth, and particularly there's quite a few segments that are expected to do well over the next years as well.
There's a saying, and it has been said several times at public forum, that India has a hub, but it sits in the Middle East. A lot of the cargo goes on the bellies of Middle Eastern carriers. And right now, when you look at, you see that Saudi Arabia has launched a new airline. There's a tough competition coming from another Middle Eastern carrier. But at the same time, we see huge tailwinds when it comes to Indian carriers, particularly Air India being taken over by Tata Group. And they're placing huge orders for wide-body passenger planes. Do you see some of these things really going well in favor of India's air cargo sector?
Yeah, well, first what you say about the Gulf carriers is true. About 50% of Indian international cargo traditionally goes by the Gulf. And then there's this huge sucking sound that comes from all the Gulf carriers, but also Indian carriers themselves who are operating services to those locations. Yeah, Indigo, Air India, others, SpiceJet that are operating capacity into the Middle East there as well. So it's not just entirely the Gulf carriers, but obviously we have with carriers like in last year, Qatar Airways had a market share of about 12% of traffic, Emirates about 11%. The other ones, Etihad and so on, are smaller. But we've seen Turkish Airlines get much bigger in the market as well. So their market share was about 5% of the Indian market last year. So in a sense, demand does follow capacity. You put a lot of capacity into there, it has the potential to suck out any cargo volumes. And this launch of the new Saudi carrier Riyadh Air is really also in line with the overall vision of the kingdom to become an air cargo hub that rivals what we see in Dubai and in Doha. Now, obviously, the big question is how much traffic is there to flight home, and that's obviously it's not just focused on the Indian market, but really focused on the overall North East, Southeast Asia to Europe air cargo market there as well. Now, in the case of Air India, you probably remember some years back, pre-2018, Indian carriers actually had a much bigger share in the market, and both Jet Airways at the time and Air India were very strong in that market. 2016, 2017, Jet Airways would have had a market share of about 11%. Air India at the time would have been around 7 or 8% of the market at the time. But obviously we're in a situation right now where a big chunk of the market moves on non-India packets. Now, whether Air India's big order will rebalance that somewhat is really hard to say. At the moment, Air India operates about 45 wide bodies. The order with Airbus and with Boeing for 350s and 777Xs and 787s is about 70 wide bodies overall. That's still a lot smaller than the kind of order levels that we're seeing in the Middle East. It's interesting to note that there are no freighters in that order. But given that Air India is going towards a mixed Airbus and Boeing fleet, well, they could opt for an A350 freighter, they could operate for a 777X freighter. So there's definitely the potential to do that. And it's been a while since Air India has operated freighters. The last A310 that they had in their fleet was taken out in 2012, which was around the time when there were actually 3 Indian carriers that were operating wide-body capacity, obviously Deccan 360 and Iran Qatar Airlines as well. And since those aircraft have been phased out, we really only see narrow-bodies operations in the Indian market. But at the same time, what we've seen over the last few years is actually an increase in the number of freighters that are going through India. So that, despite yield levels being challenging for a lot of carriers, it's obviously been interesting enough for other non-Indian carriers to put capacity and freighter capacity into that market.
Frederic, from your readings, from your research, from talking to different people in the industry, do you see a potential for Air India to really become competitive with the Middle Eastern carriers and really become a threat to some of them, and potentially Air India launches freighter operations as well?
I don't think Air India will ever have the scale to really become a threat, but what we do tend to see overall with decently sized combination carriers is that having this mix of passenger aircraft complemented with freighter aircraft is actually a good thing. And you see it a bit also if you look at the trade and the traffic flows into India. A lot of the air freight relevant exports are coming primarily from China, but also other parts of Northeastern and Southeast Asia. And a lot of the export traffic is actually destined for westbound direction. So that's where freighters start to make sense in a big combination carrier network to really complement those sectors where there's not enough passenger capacity available to do that. So I think it makes a lot of sense for a carrier like Air India to be looking at wide-bodied freighters, particularly since they can operate them as part of their other fleets. Now obviously for the likes of Indigo or SpiceJet that have just pure narrow body fleets, it's a different story. Now, of course, there's also the opportunity for a pure all cargo Indian all cargo carrier to develop, but there's obviously a different risk profile for a pure all cargo operation than there would be for a combination carrier operation. I mean, some of the profit margins that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years have been very, very unusual. So normally in the freighter business, if you're running operating profit margins at sort of between 6 and 8%, that's good. In 2021 and 2022, particularly, operating profit margins for carriers like Lufthansa Cargo or for Cargolux were more in the order of about 35 to 40%. So it's a completely different situation, and you do see this cargo bump in some of the Indian carrier results as well. So SpiceJet was an example where their cargo business throughout the last few years was much larger in terms of their overall revenue. So you might remember sort of 2018, 2019. Obviously, this is pre-freighters as well. SpiceJet's cargo business would have been generating around $50 million a year in revenue in the 2022 fiscal year, when they were operating up to five freighters. They're down to 3 freighters now. That revenue was in excess of $250 million. So there was a yield bump. There was also the additional capacity that was in there. But that's not necessarily a normal situation. So despite there being an opportunity in the market, we also need to realize there are risks, because yield letters can't stay the way they were in the last 3 years.
Till about a few years back, the only freighter operator that we could be proud of was Blue Dart. Then came SpiceJet, and in the last 1 year, as you rightly mentioned in your report, there are 3 cargo carriers. What is the sense that you get from these 3 operators launched in India last 8 months or 9 months?
Well, they're very different in terms of their operations, right? So obviously Blue Dart's been operating the same network for the last 10, 15 years, more or less the same number of aircraft. Yes, we had the increase from 737s to 757s, so that was an increase in gauge. They're an operating platform. They're a well-run airline, works like clockwork, and obviously support the overall Blue Dart Express network. Now, what we have seen, before I get to the other ones, what we have seen in Blue Dart's network is actually the share of their traffic that moves within their air network is actually declining. It doesn't mean their air network is declining, but most of the growth is on the ground. And that's an important factor in the Indian domestic market, that actually most of the e-commerce growth, and it's all e-commerce growth that's driving that, is actually happening in ground networks, and there are good reasons for that. So, for example, the e-commerce logistics provider platform Delivery generates about 88 US cents per shipment in revenue. That doesn't leave a lot of money, if any money at all, to pay for air capacity, which is obviously why we're seeing a lot of this traffic moving on the ground. So in that context, the whole QuickJet operation is actually quite interesting, where Amazon has in India done what they've done first in the US and then in Europe, is actually set up a dedicated air network to support their own logistics operation. Now, Amazon is the biggest platform in India. Amazon is probably 50% bigger at least in terms of web traffic than Flipkart. And Amazon is also very, very unique in terms of the way it manages its air capacity. Now, Amazon essentially created a market that wasn't there before. First in the US, then in Europe. These days, Amazon is operating in excess of 110 aircraft, dedicated aircraft. Other e-commerce platforms haven't really followed this, at least not to the extent. We do see Mercado Libre in Latin America with its own dedicated air network that they really launched in full in 2020. We see obviously Channel with dedicated air capacity supporting its cross-border network. We see JD Airlines having also started up their own airline. What we haven't seen is other platforms within the US or Flipkart for that matter set up their own dedicated air network. There is a degree of potential there, but what we found with other platforms is that they tended to just rely on third-party providers to move their shipments. And that may end up in some air networks as well. In the Indian domestic market, that would be primarily belly capacity. Also, just because yield levels tend to be about 50 cents a kilo, again, it's hard to operate a freighter for that. And there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's quite a few failed Indian startups that wanted to focus on the domestic air express business and actually weren't successful. I mean, Deccan 360 is obviously a classic example where they were really trying to mimic what Blue Dart was doing. First Flight Couriers for a while had their own aircraft capacity that they were operating. Obviously now the company's in liquidation, but generally that hasn't worked too well in the domestic market. So what you see with Indigo's operation and with SpiceJet's operation and with Pradhan's operation, it's the freight operation is primarily an international operation. So Indigo's network is primarily focused on connecting Mumbai and Delhi with Sharjah or with other points in the Middle East, or Eastern India with Myanmar. There seems to be a decent amount of air freight traffic on that route. Pradhan is somewhat similar in terms of its outlook, but there the focus is more on connecting Delhi with Vietnam. And it's interesting this Myanmar and Vietnam connection that we're seeing, because it's also off the back of increasing trade between India and these countries as well. So there's some interesting developments happening there, and the type of aircraft they're operating, the 321, 320, is quite good for those kind of routes. So the 2-3 hour routes, you've got a good range payload performance on those aircraft. SpiceJet's network is a bit all over the place at the moment. Obviously, their freighter fleet is much smaller today than it was up to about August last year. There they had 5 aircraft, 3 737-700s and 2 737-800s. The 800s were sent back to the lessor. We think they're going to Blue Dart. That seems to be where they're going to end up. So that would lead to an increase in Blue Dart's fleet. But SpiceJet also does a lot of international stuff, really using Eastern India as a jump-off point to, there's been a lot of charter type flying to Wuhan, to other parts of southern China, also to Vietnam, to Myanmar, to Singapore, some flights to the Middle East, and so on. So it's sort of every carrier has a little bit different, but it's really Blue Dart and QuickJet are the only domestic network. So QuickJet is, in terms of the network footprint, almost like a mini version of what Blue Dart is. I mean, we have connections from Delhi to Mumbai. We have connections from Delhi to Bangalore and Hyderabad as well. But that's really about it. We have noticed with the QuickJet operation, and that's something that we've seen with Amazon elsewhere, is it operates pretty much 7 days a week rather than 5.5 or 6 days a week. And the number of sectors they put on the aircraft per day tend to be much more than some of the express carriers get. So they're definitely operating in a more higher utilization environment than say Blue Dart.
So we have seen the figure as 2.2 million tons of cargo handled through Indian airports. Given the conditions, given what you have seen in the last 1 year, what would be the approximate volume that Indian airports would handle in 2023 from 22.2 million to, do you think that India has the capability in the current circumstances to reach 3 million?
Yeah, what we've actually, I'm not sure about that at the moment, and there's a reason for that. So we have seen trade volumes and air cargo volumes start to drop off a little bit towards the end of the year. That's not a particularly Indian phenomenon. That's happened in other markets as well. That we've really seen a drop in volumes there. Yeah, if I'd venture a guess, I'd say probably end up in around the more like around the 2.4, 2.5 million mark to be lucky. I think the 3 million mark is unrealistic to achieve, even when passenger capacity comes back, just because of the overall global economic weakness overall. And when it comes to trade, India is actually, in terms of its focus on trade as a percentage of economic activity, it's actually very similar to China or the world average. So one measure that we often look at is we look at the percentage of trade relative to GDP. And both in India and China, it's around the 34% mark. It used to be much higher in China. So what we've seen in China, and this is in a way relevant for the Indian discussion as well, is that Chinese growth overall was very, very manufacturing driven until sort of the mid 2000s. But after that, the role of the domestic economy was more and more important, and the role of trade got less and less. We haven't seen the same development in India. We've really seen trade reach a level of sort of 30-35% of GDP and actually stay at that level as well. And another factor that I think is quite important, India is home to at least 5 or 6 big conglomerates that actually invest abroad. But these are Indian companies that are investing abroad, so the lead to India remains, and that leads to movement of components, movement of finished goods, and so on. So from a perspective of Indian trade growth, having these despite all the problems that they often bring, having these large companies actually facilitates trade to and from India as well.
Frederic, is there any specific highlights that from the report that you would want to share with the readers?
What I do think, and this is quite important, is that the momentum that we're seeing in the Indian cargo market at the moment with the additional, with the 5 airlines that we have now, and there's another 5 that have talked about starting up. Obviously, not all of them will make it. I do think we are in a window of opportunity right now for Indian-based all cargo operations. And I think the thing that's really missing in India at the moment is actually a wide-body freighter operator, Indian-based wide-body freighter operator. I do think there's the market potential there and the fleet potential to be able to do that.
Frederic, thank you so much. Really appreciate joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
For the latest news on air freight, keep visiting stattimes.com. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Visit and subscribe our YouTube channel for exclusive one-to-one interviews with global logistic leaders and for recordings of all our past webinars and virtual conferences.